Welcome to Just Plain Wrong, the podcast where three Mennonite librarians discuss Amish fiction and depictions of Amish, Mennonites, and other plain groups in pop culture. This is our first episode where we're reviewing a piece of media, and boy, do we have a treat for you. We are discussing the Amish romance book, His Pretend Amish Bride, by Rachel Good, and we'll talk more about the plot in a minute. But before we begin, since this is our first episode on Amish romance, I thought we could start this episode by just chatting about our familiarity with this genre. So is this your first Amish book? What are your impressions of Amish romance? Any other stories about it that you'd like to share with us? So Abby.
This was indeed my first Amish fiction, Amish romance book to read. I am not particularly familiar with the genre. I had not read it much myself. Now I have read some romance, and I read, but it's probably considered, I think, probably the classic best romance genre ever, which is Sweet Valley High, which I think there's like 150 books in that series, and I probably read 100 of them. In junior high, I was one of those readers who was I basically figured out what I liked and just read that all the time. I remember my parents being kind of concerned because Sweet Valley High kind of borderline had some slight issues of like sex and drugs and things that they thought were vaguely inappropriate, but they did let me read it. So yeah, so we'll see how this compares.
I was more of a Babysitter's Club gal myself, but I did dabble occasionally in the Sweet Valley High. All right, Tilly, what about you?
Well, I did not read any Sweet Valley High, and I only read one Babysitter's Club book. And my great-grandmother had given me the book, and every time it had the phrase, "oh my God," in it, she had put a sticker over the word God so that the characters were not taking the Lord's name in vain.
Oh, that's
so that's my experience with that genre. My romance reading has been pretty limited to fairly mainstream stuff when I'm in a whimsical mood. So this was also my first Amish romance, first Christian romance, first inspirational romance, which as far as I can tell is a slightly less confrontational way to say Christian romance. And I thought it was interesting.
Yeah, it's for me also not a genre, romance or Amish romance that I read a whole lot of, though my first exposure was much earlier. So my first job after college was at the Mennonite Historical Library, where I was an administrative assistant. One of the jobs of the administrative assistant is to go through all of the books that the library gets to make sure that it has all the pages. And this was, starting in 2004. So not quite the peak of Amish romance, but there were definitely Amish romances already. So occasionally I would spend an afternoon literally flipping through them. And I won't lie, I'm sure I mostly read a Beverly Lewis book or two during that time. So it's interesting to approach it sort of from this angle where we're kind of reading to critique a little bit more versus just absorb the story. All right, well, on to the book. It's called His Pretend Amish Bride, and it is from the Unexpected Amish Blessings series by Rachel Good. I believe the first book in this series has the very enticing title of His Unexpected Amish Twins, which I really think we need to come back to because I want to know how you have unexpected twins. Rachel Good grew up near Lancaster County and has published just a ton of books, I think more than 25 or so, and only started publishing these books in 2016. So rather prolific in a very short amount of time. So the plot of this book, we have Priscilla Ebersol as is the main female protagonist. And at the start of the book, she discovers her boyfriend, Matthew, is cheating on her. Soon after, like hours later, she meets Gabe Kaufman, who recently moved to the Lancaster area to start a camel farm. Priscilla is interested in the camel farm and particularly in camel milk, which she thinks she might help her brother Asher, who has autism. Gabe, though, has a dark secret and is not interested in dating, but despite both of them being scorned or not interested, they seem to hit it off. There's a really random side plot where these bad Englishers are trying to force Gabe to sell the farm to them and like getting the FDA involved, and Priscilla brings in reporters to stop them. And the bad guys think that Priscilla and Gabe are married, hence the Pretend Amish Bride title of the text. Whew. So that's the plot. Did I miss anything important?
There's a small plot point where Priscilla does not tell anyone else that her boyfriend has cheated on her in order to protect his integrity. So all of her actions are perceived with incredulity by her mother, who doesn't know why she and her boyfriend have broken up and refuses to get back together with him. And then so there's this tarnishing of her name, and she can't stand up for herself because she is protecting her douchebag boyfriend.
Yes, I'd forgotten. There's so many plot lines. And it's only it took 2.5 hours to read. So it's not like it's that long. So yes, in case you haven't gathered, we found this book to be maybe very entertaining, but also a little ridiculous. And there were just tons of plot lines. So let's start by discussing that. Did you have a favorite plot line or a section of the book that you found particularly enjoyable? And you could have found it enjoyable because it was accurate or wildly inaccurate or just entertaining. So Abby, we'll start with you.
I definitely did find the whole villain plot line to be highly amusing, mostly because it reminded me of old-fashioned cartoons where the villain, has this long mustache that they twirl, and it was just so over the top and obvious and also bizarrely convoluted. They were clearly villains, but their actual like in cartoons, their actual plan to achieve their villainy was very confusing and hard to figure out why they wanted this upstart camel farm to begin with. However, it did lead to some really great lines. I thought that, let's put it this way, we're not exactly subtle. So the two villains are a secretly married husband and wife, and the woman. So this is how she's introduced, and this is on page 20. So this is pretty early. It's pretty obvious right away who the bad people are. And this is the line: "I am Florette Moreau." The woman extended a dainty hand with highly polished, long, claw-like nails. "A predator." So in case you had any doubts, that's about as mustache twirly as I think you can get.
Sort of going off that of Florette Moreau, evil French woman kind of name. I thought the names stood out to me as just not quite right. The characters in the periphery seemed to be pretty traditionally named. The last names were okay. Ebersol is a name I'm familiar with. Kaufman is a name I'm familiar with. Priscilla, I can sort of, and Gabriel or Gabe, I can sort of envision an Amish family using. But then there were the side characters like Asher and a Jaden. And I just thought, those are names that trended in the English world. And I don't know that they would have functioned in an Amish society in the same way. Especially not when you've got standbys like Joseph and Noah and David and Benjamin to go with.
Yeah, I think Priscilla is a stretch personally, but yeah, definitely better than some of the others. For me, my favorite / most nomination for most ridiculous was the whole deep, dark secret thing that gets mentioned page 2, but not really revealed until 2 pages from the end. My favorite line in the whole text was on page 12. "Instead, another out of control buggy flashed through his mind." And we just hear he has these flashbacks. And we'll talk more about the ending of the book later in this discussion, but the way it was presented, I just found really amusing in the text. It just kept being alluded to. It's he was staring off into the distance and having these flashbacks, but we didn't actually know what happened until very late in the book. All right. So Tilly, you've already touched a little on the names as an inaccuracy, but are there other inaccuracies that jumped out to you as you read the book?
Yes. Yes, there are. The biggest thing for me is just sort of, not only is this a rosy picture of Amish life, it's literally a rosy picture of Amish life. And since the main characters either run a farm or live on a farm, there's a surprising lack of real world consequences for farm life. And I grew up on a farm that my Dad and my uncle had phased out any livestock before I was born. So I didn't milk cows or take care of horses or anything myself, but I have spent enough time on farms and in that area and spent enough time with camels, riding one or seeing them around, walking them around, to know that they, like all livestock, do not smell like daisies. They smell like camels, and they spit, and they're weird, and they're a little bit gross. And there's this lovely line at the first meeting of Priscilla and Gabe. And Gabe has just had a run-in with this reckless buggy driver, who happens to be Priscilla's ex, who was going too fast. So he throws himself on top of and in front of a young camel to protect it from the buggy, which just sounds like a dangerous thing to do. So he smells like camel. And then he goes up and he helps calm this horse that presumably smells like horse. And then he walks across a field that presumably smells like a field and has camel dung in it. And then he goes into the shop and talks to Priscilla. And Priscilla notes that he just smells laundry fresh. And
maybe that's what she thinks laundry smells like.
And either she's got a really odd sense of what laundry smells like that is,
or maybe
possible.
She has COVID and has lost her sense of smell.
Suffice to say, she is near him and he is handing her something across the counter and she smells the freshness of his laundry. And I had to snort a little at that because, look, people can smell good and nature can smell good. And some people like the smell of horses, but I know of no one who likes the smell of camels. It just asks too much of me. Think he's attractive. Don't think he smells good.
All right, Abby, what about you?
Well, kind of touching on that, I did think it was very interesting. So I was born in Lancaster, but moved to the Midwest when I was 10, but I have a number of family members and my mom grew up on a family farm in Lancaster. And it is definitely not a place where if you are a young, relatively, probably not super rich, young Amish man looking to get your camel farm up and going, it is not a place where you can afford to buy land. It is pretty much full and there is not a lot of space left. And I remember when the family farm sold down to the next generation and I found out how much that farm cost or how much the land would have been worth. And it was a little bit mind-blowing. So yeah, the whole idea of some young Amish man looking to escape his dark secret of a past is not going to move to Lancaster to get his fresh start. Yeah. Not so much.
For me, my inaccuracy is actually more of a plot inconsistency than an actual Amish inaccuracy. But there's this moment where Priscilla is talking about the benefits of camel milk for autism, and she talks at length with Gabe about how she goes to the library and does scholarly research, and they like literally discuss sample sizes. And first of all, that's totally possible. Amish can do research. They can go to the library. However, most of them only have an 8th grade education. So understanding things like sample size, while possible, seems maybe a bit unlikely. But more than that, I was struck in the text how they're having this very intelligent conversation that involves like critical thinking and sample size and all of this. But then at the same time, they are so easily fooled by the very obvious actions of these villains who are like, well, I can't give you the fair price for the milk because of this charity I run. And it just... It really bothered me. I'm not sure why, just because it seemed so ridiculous to paint them as both very capable of doing scholarly research and incapable of seeing through this very transparent villain. So anyway, that jumped out to me. The next question. So this gets into a plot point that we haven't even talked about yet, because there are even more subplots. So there's a reporter that gets involved as a way for Priscilla and Gabe to keep the villains at bay, keep them from trying to take over this farm and that they're trying to buy. Anyway, so this reporter, she becomes a Christian by talking to Priscilla, and on Priscilla's recommendation, she starts reading the Bible. And then the next time we meet the reporter, I can't remember her name.
Alyssa, I think.
Alyssa, thank you. So Alyssa, like a week later, she's read the Bible and she's a Christian. So that struck me as amusing. But this was also one of the first Amish books I read. So I didn't realize until we had read a few more books that this is actually a fairly common theme, that religion and even this evangelical thread is in there. So Abby, can you talk for a little bit on how faith and religion are depicted in this book?
Yeah, this is definitely something I was struck by. And I think it's probably not necessarily fair to say this of the whole genre of Amish romance, but many of the people who write in this are coming from an evangelical Christian perspective, and fairly or not, it definitely feels like some of these books are, Christian romance with a bit of a thin veneer Amish layer applied over the top. And that one part that I think kind of bothered me was the way that ended up depicting issues of faith, because Amish have a wide variety of they have their own faith tradition that is a vibrant one. However, it is not the same one as the one that is typically portrayed or experienced in evangelical Christian circles. Evangelical Christians tend to have a lot of God talk. They tend to be very focused on prayer and use a certain language turns of phrase like, touched my heart and hearing God's word and certain other tropes, I guess, that are really common. And so to see those kind of transplanted into this book that is about Amish characters felt really a little bit disingenuous. Yes, this author had learned enough about Amish to know that they drove buggies and to know that some of the kind of superficial parts of their life, but didn't really understand some of the different ways that Amish actually, their faith differs. And I actually, in talking about this, Tilly, I feel like really hit the nail on the head. So I want to leave it to her to kind of describe some of the differences between or what Amish faith is a little more about versus the evangelical Christian.
Yeah, I like the term that you used, veneer. I think that's a good way to describe this book, which was in many ways factually accurate. It had the veneer of accuracy, but when it came to motivation and behavior and belief, it didn't ring true. It was plywood underneath. And for me, the big disassociation came with the fact that the characters were all very, not selfish, but individually oriented. They had personal relationships with God. They read the Bible. They looked to do the things that they needed to do for their life, but they were focused on sort of their own careers, their own romantic interests. And there wasn't a sense of community-driven purpose in religion or in just general behavior, which goes against what I know of Amish people and older Mennonites and other similar groups that are much more informed by togetherness. So because of things like having an 8th grade education and because of things related to the history of Anabaptism, there's a sense that interpreting the Bible isn't necessarily something that you do on your own. You can do it on your own, but faith is held up by community. So you don't have a personal relationship with God as much as you have a connection to a community that together is trying to be godly, to be a godly kingdom. So there's certain stuff like you didn't really know why these people stayed in the Amish church or why these people lived a lifestyle that they did. No one ever came out and said, community matters to me, plainness matters to me, upholding tradition matters to me. There was none of that. It was just taken for granted, which, granted, I don't think people walk around declaring their purpose to everyone, but at the same time, I think they have a purpose, and I didn't see it in this book.
Great. Thank you both for tackling that question. So we're going to talk about the ending, but maybe before we jump into the ending when we finally know Gabe's secret, let's resolve a couple other plot lines. So as you may have imagined, Gabe and Priscilla end up together. Yay. Priscilla's mother learns to be okay with this change and understands why Priscilla and the ex are no longer together. And the reporters do succeed in tracking down enough information on the bad guys to expose them, and they disappear. I've read this book twice now, and I still don't really even understand that plot line. Like, whatever. But at the very end, we finally learn what's bothering Gabe this whole time, why he keeps having these flashbacks. We learn that he was in this buggy accident. The girl he was engaged to is flung from the buggy, and it's sort of implied, I thought, that she had died. So I won't lie, this was a plot twist I did not see coming. I thought she was dead. And so all of a sudden at the end, Anna walks in and she's alive, and she then sort of releases Gabe from his engagement and allows him to commit to Priscilla. I found this great because it was so unexpected and entertaining, but were you equally surprised? What were your thoughts on this character's sudden arrival in the very last pages?
Oh, I was mad. They never outright said it, but as soon as we got to the first time, Gabe has this sort of PTSD flashback of a buggy going out of control, I thought, he's got a girlfriend in a coma. And I was convinced that she was in a coma. So when she walked, over to him and released him and came from one county over to Lancaster to release him from a promise he made as a 17-year-old 6 years earlier. He's been keeping this promise for 6 years. I was mostly irritated. She says, Anna met his gaze. I do forgive you, Gabe. I never should have made you wait this long for an answer. She stared down at the floorboards. Remember, I told you no in the hospital? Many times. You should have listened. And I thought, yes, you should have. I shouldn't have made you wait this long for an answer. She didn't. She said no insistently, and he said he just sort of refused to do it out of, I don't know, patriarchal notions of propriety or honor or who knows what exactly. And so she gives him this, in order to get him to drop it, she tells him if she can walk across the room, if she is healed enough that she can walk again, she'll give him his answer to his marriage proposal. And so in some ways, no, she shouldn't have waited so long. I think 6 years is a little too long to pull that sort of thing. But it also sounds like she sure knew her own mind earlier, and he really should have taken her advice. And I feel like the community, this is another area where you don't see community support. You don't see his family or his siblings or his bishop saying anything like, it's okay to break off this engagement, or it's okay to move on. And similarly, they're not there when the evil Englishers are plotting to buy the farm. No, I was just angry at him. I just thought, don't marry him, Priscilla. He doesn't listen to women.
Thanks, Tilly. Abby, what were your thoughts?
Similarly, I don't think I had as clearly a fixed idea of what exactly the dark secret was. I'm pretty sure it involved a girlfriend and a buggy accident, but I didn't have a clear sense. I will say one thing, this is kind of segueing a little bit, I think maybe into the next question, but I do feel like maybe Gabe has experienced some growth, because while he clearly wasn't prepared to listen to his girlfriend when she was trying to tell him no, one of the things I did really like about this book was that despite the fact that Priscilla and Gabe both had their strengths and weaknesses as individuals, it was very clear that they kind of could both rise to the occasion and bring out their best on behalf of the other. Priscilla, who can barely, who can't stand up for herself enough to keep her lousy ex-boyfriend from ruining her reputation. Gabe actually goes and confronts the ex-boyfriend, and Gabe, who for whatever reason can't seem to put two words together in any kind of business setting or any kind of even remotely public setting, Priscilla can do that and does a great job. So it did kind of warm my heart to be like, okay, so they're a little bit odd characters who maybe have some flaws, but they've managed to find ways that, like, hopefully, they'll still have somehow their little camel farm in the middle of Lancaster County. I'm sure they'll just have a great little business because Priscilla will run the business and Gabe will, I guess, maybe be in charge of their community reputation. I'm not sure about that one, but yeah, that's one part I enjoyed.
I suppose that's true. I should cut him a little bit of slack for having growth, even if he was not quite smart enough to realize that he should reevaluate a promise he made as a 17-year-old.
So before we rate this book on our amazing rating scale of 1 to 5 pints of camel milk, are there any other scenes or favorite lines you want to mention?
I think it's worth a bit of a shout out to say that the book's portrayal of autism, and actually the book's portrayal of children, such as Priscilla's younger autistic brother, is lacking. It's definitely oversimplified. There's not really much awareness of autism as a spectrum that affects people in different ways, and that people with autism embrace or deny in different ways. It's just sort of there, I think, so that Priscilla can look virtuous. Same as her work with other special needs kids. And that was sort of frustrating, but there was, to be frank, a lot of showing or telling without showing in this book. So I think that might be a stylistic issue as well as a autism awareness issue.
I will say I did take a cue from Priscilla and Gabe and quickly search PubMed and did find that there are several studies on camel milk and autism. So I do think it served mostly as a plot device. Like, he's a camel farmer, so what reason would she have to go visit his farm? And to anyone listening, it's like 3 studies. I wouldn't say they're conclusive. So we're not going to get into the whole debate about whether or not camel milk can help. I just will say that there is apparently research being done on that. So that wasn't super out there. Abby, anything you'd like to add? Lines, scenes, both positive or negative?
I think the only other thing I was going to mention was I did think it was interesting that they took the route of, so Priscilla's parents, she has a loving, sensible, good relationship with her dad, who is a source of calm advice for her. And then she has a slightly fraught relationship with her mother, who is gossipy and kind of played as kind of a Mrs. Bennet type. So I'm not sure if it was a little interesting to see that play out. Obviously, every book is going to have its tropes, but that's not exactly my favorite trope. So I'm kind of curious to see how often we'll see that repeated in other books that we read.
And I feel that we would be remiss to not mention that this book ends with a very bizarre and kind of amazing erotic camel milking scene, which, if you've forgotten from a few minutes ago, camels smell. Tilly has made it very clear that camels and farming is not a place for good smells. I have it here. Maybe I'll just read a little sentence. And the best part to me is that Priscilla already knows how to milk animals. She's literally just doing this because she wants to be close to Gabe, and they're engaged now, but they're not quite married. But here we go. Once the next camel was in place, he knelt beside her as she sat on the stool, then reached around her to position her hands. She relaxed back against him with a soft sigh, a sigh that set all his pulses thrumming. And that's about as racy as you can get in one of these Amish romance books. Yeah, yeah. Other than the flashbacks, that's my favorite part.
I will say I'd forgotten that is such a good one to bring up, because it's so clear when reading that the author has not actually ever milked a camel or a cow or anything. And I think it's quite clear that in the author's head, she's definitely picturing the Patrick Swayze clay scene from Ghost and trying to transpose that into the Amish world by deciding that somehow milking and throwing a pot on a wheel are similar enough that you can get, I don't know, the same kind of sexy scene out of it. I have not milked a camel, but I am fairly certain that's not how it works.
If any camel farmers would like to write in and let us know, Please do. All right, so now it is time to rate this book. So we're going to rate this week on a scale of 1 to 5 pints of camel milk, and you're going to each give 2 ratings, one just sort of general enjoyment, and one more thinking about accuracy. So Abby, why don't we start with you?
I mean, this is the first Amish romance that I've read. So I think I did, in some ways, I kind of enjoyed the some of the more bizarre plot twists and decisions about certain wording and things. So at the same time, I have to say and I mean, no offense to Rachel J. Good, but I did not find the writing to be particularly strong. So I think I would probably give this about maybe a 2.5 in terms of the enjoyability. It was like I enjoyed reading it, but it was kind of cotton candy. As for accuracy, I think they got some of the obvious things right, but I feel like underneath the surface were some pretty major flaws. So I'm gonna give that 2. Actually, I'll give it a 3 for an enjoyability. 3 pints for enjoyability and 2 for accuracy.
Lily, do you agree?
I do. I might flip those numbers from you, Abby. I think it gets a 2 for enjoyability for me. I enjoyed predicting things ahead of time and being right. And I enjoyed the novelty of all the things that were going on, the way that the plot kept throwing things at you that shouldn't have necessarily happened. Like the Englishers' evil, dastardly deeds and the sudden conversions to Christianity and etc. I thought were entertaining. I don't know that they were meant to be entertaining in the way that I enjoyed them. And I think as far as accuracy goes, she got a lot of the basics right, and she missed some of the common pitfalls. So she had the right ideas about clothing, about how men and women sit on different sides of church, about how Amish families play games together that don't use face cards and instead play things like Uno. So there was an awareness of the mechanics of Amish life, but there was not an awareness of deeper motivations of Amish life. So it still only gets a 3.
All right. I guess I agree with you both on the accuracy, 2 to 3, somewhere in there. But I feel like I found this book to just be completely enjoyable. I read the entire book in one sitting, and in like 2.5, 3 hours, I don't know. It was just, a roller coaster. It was here, it was there. There were bad guys. There was camel milk. I don't know. It was, I kind of loved it in a way that you like latch on to like a bad movie that you just love so much, even though it's kind of bad. Anyway, so I might, for enjoyability, go all the way up to 4 pints of camel milk, but keep that accuracy. I agree with both of you that it got a lot right. It missed some things, but now that we've read a few other books, even though those episodes haven't aired, they're things that lots of people seem to get wrong. So we'll go 4 for enjoyment, and maybe hit the gap there and go 2.5 pints of camel milk accuracy.
Like camel milk, it seems to be an acquired taste.
All right. Well, that wraps up our discussion on His Pretend Amish Bride. Again, there are other books in this series. This was number 2, so feel free to pick up books 1 or 3, which I think is coming out any day now. And if you have questions, stories, comments, seriously, if you're a camel farmer and want to chime in, let us know. Our email is plainwrongpod@gmail.com. You can also follow us at Twitter and Instagram at plainwrongpod. And we will be back on Wednesday to discuss the 1997 classic movie For Richer, For Poorer. So see you next week.